In the unforgiving expanse of West Texas, where trust is scarcer than water, destiny is often forged not by the bullet, but by a desperate whisper. For the widow Rachel Garrett, destiny arrived not on the thunder of hooves, but in the helpless cry of a child of a blood that was not her own. For the Apache warrior Elan Nantan, it came in the humbling act of placing his people's very legacy into the hands of a sworn enemy. Their story began with a single choice, one that would either forge a bridge between two worlds or burn them both to ashes. The knock came sudden and sharp, tearing through the twilight quiet of the Lone Mesa high plains. Rachel Garrett started, her heart lurching. Her hands, calloused from labor, went instantly to the Winchester rifle propped in the corner, a familiar companion in her solitude. Another knock, harder this time, like a desperate plea. Then a voice, fractured and raw, carried from outside. "Please. My son, he's dying." It was not the voice of a threat. It was the sound of a man at the end of his rope. Rachel took a deep breath, her caution giving way to a worried curiosity. She slid the bolt and pulled the stubborn door open. A tall Apache man stood there, silhouetted against the fiery sunset. His eyes were deep, holding a desert of weariness, and in his arms was an infant, terrifyingly still. Its skin was so thin that it showed the rack of its ribs, its lips dry and cracked out in the distance. The lanterns of the townsfolk had been lit, like judging fireflies. The wind carried their whispers. "It's an Apache," a voice hissed. "Don't you dare let him in." But Rachel no longer heard them. Everything else had faded, leaving only the tiny, dying creature in the man's arms. She saw loss, an image she knew all too well. She stepped out from the safety of her doorway. "Give him to me." The warrior hesitated, a flicker of ingrained suspicion in his eyes. "I have milk," she said, her voice firmer. "Out here he will die." With a solemn nod, he passed the child to her, as carefully as if he were handing over the last precious thing on earth. Rachel took the small being, turned back inside, and sat in the rocking chair by the hearth. Without a moment's hesitation, she unbuttoned her dress and gently guided the baby's mouth to her breast. Its small lips fumbled, then weakly latched on. She let out a long, shaky breath as tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. The Apache man remained kneeling at the pond threshold, as silent as a stone. As the child began to draw its first nourishment, he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion, "You saved him. You saved us both." Rachel didn't answer. She only held the child closer, rocking gently. The night was falling, but inside the small log cabin, beside the fire, a warmth more potent than the flames had just begun to kindle. Time was no longer measured by the sun or moon, but by the hungry cries of a child and the silent visits before dawn. Each morning, while frost still clung to the grass, Elan would appear at the edge of the woods, wrapped in a worn wool blanket, holding his son. The boy, whom Rachel now called Nathaniel, no longer had the pale skin of starvation. His small hands had begun to reach for her whenever he saw her face. Rachel would open her arms, and the child would melt against her as if it were the place he had always belonged. "You have named him," Elan said quietly one morning, his gaze following as Rachel fed the boy by the fire. "I had to call him something," she replied, her fingers gently brushing through Nathaniel's soft black hair. "And Nathaniel means gift of God. That feels right, doesn't it?" Elan did not meet her eyes, but he gave the smallest of nods. Their communication was woven not with words, but with silent actions. When Elan came to collect his son in the afternoon, Rachel would give him slices of cornbread wrapped carefully in cloth, or a bowl of hot stew. "For the road," was all she would say. He refused at first, but she insisted, "I'm not giving out of debt. I'm giving because that boy needs his father to be strong." And each night, long after the fire had died to embers, Rachel would stand by the window, looking out over the vast plains under the silver moon, One night, she saw him. A tall silhouette, standing silently beneath the twisted branches of a distant cottonwood. He did not approach. He simply stood vigil. She did not light a lamp. She did not call to him. But her breath caught in her throat, not in fear, but from something else, a presence. A protection. The next morning, when she returned from the well, a small object sat beside Nathaniel's makeshift cradle. It was a tiny horse, no longer than her palm, carved from dark cedar. Every curve of its body was meticulously shaped, its legs bent in a full gallop, its mane flowing in an imaginary wind. On the belly of the horse, careful letters were carved. So he will always remember his courage. That evening, for the first time, she invited him inside. "You can come in," she said softly. Elan hesitated, then crossed the threshold, sitting on the floor near the hearth while she held Nathaniel. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the walls. After a long while, Rachel broke the silence. "You're not what they say you are." "I am what this land made me," Elan replied. "But I have never harmed your people." "I believe you," she nodded. Later that night, after Nathaniel was asleep, the silence between them deepened. The wind howled outside, scratching at the walls like a hungry animal. "Elijah," Rachel began, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the flames. "My son, he had red hair, like the color of a burning autumn leaf. He was only 6 weeks old when the fever came." Elan said nothing, but his gaze never left her. "I did everything," she continued, her voice breaking. "I held him for hours, hoping my own warmth could fight the cold that was taking him. It was no use." The silence stretched again. Elan slowly reached into a leather pouch at his waist and drew out something wrapped in deerskin. He handed it to her. Rachel carefully unfolded it. Inside was a square of rough linen, stained by time. At its center, a sun with long rays was embroidered in golden thread. The stitches were imperfect, but made by a loving hand. "My wife," Elan said, his voice low and even. "She made this for our son's naming day. He never received it. Your soldiers came the next moon. She died protecting him." Rachel clutched the cloth, feeling his pain as if it were her own. "You brought my son the light," he said, breaking the silence. "I feared you would turn us away." "And I," she whispered, "I feared I had nothing left to give." They sat there, two people bent by loss, but not broken. The fire crackled in the hearth, and in the stillness between them, something fragile but strong had begun to take root. It had no name yet, but it felt very much like healing. News in Lone Mesa traveled like a prairie fire in the dry season. It was not carried in public proclamations, but in lingering glances, in conversations that fell silent when Rachel passed, and in whispers that floated like smoke, staining everything. They touched. "She's nursing a redskin's baby," they said. "Raising him like he was her own. The woman's lost her mind." The fury came on a late afternoon when the air was still and thick. The rumble of hooves and the heavy tread of boots on dry earth announced their arrival. Rachel was holding Nathaniel, humming a wordless tune her mother used to sing, when a harsh, angry voice called her name from the yard. "Rachel Garrett! Get out here now." She placed a gentle kiss on Nathaniel's forehead and stepped onto the porch, the child nestled against her shoulder. 6 men stood there, the air around them smelling of hay, dust, and a dangerous, righteous indignation. At the front was Amos Dillard, the feed store owner, his face red with rage, his fists clenched. "You are betraying your own kind," Amos growled, his voice trembling. "Sheltering that Apache, feeding his child. Do you even remember what they did in these parts? Have you forgotten the raids, the spilled blood?" Rachel looked down at Nathaniel's sleeping face, innocent and trusting. "I remember loss," she said softly, her voice just loud enough for them to hear. "I don't need reminding what it looks like. He is not one of us." Another man named Caleb shouted. "He is a child," Rachel replied, her voice calm. and he is hungry." Then she did something none of them could have anticipated. She walked down the steps, her bare feet on the warm earth, and stood directly before them. The baby stirred, a tiny hand flailing. Without a moment of hesitation, Rachel adjusted her shawl, shifted Nathaniel gently in her arms, and brought him to her breast. Gasps of shock rippled through the group of men like a cold wind. The rifles on their backs seemed to tremble. Rachel lifted her chin, her gaze unwavering. "This child is not your enemy," she said, her voice firm. "But you are starting to sound like mine." No one spoke. The air thickened in a silence so heavy it felt like it could shatter. Just then, slow, measured footsteps approached from the path. Miriam Quinn, widow of the town's first preacher, a small woman with sharp, intelligent eyes, walked into the yard. She did not look at the men. She walked straight past their circle, past their glares and grumbles, carrying the small covered clay pot. She gently set the pot on Rachel's porch step. "Chicken stew," she said quietly, "with barley. For the baby and for his mother." She looked at Rachel, then at Nathaniel, her eyes filled with understanding. "Feed him. That is what mothers do." With that, she turned and walked away, her head held high, without a trace of fear. The silence that followed was heavier than the midday sun. Amos spat on the ground. "This isn't over," he muttered, then turned on his heel and stormed off. The others shuffled after him, their boots kicking up dust, leaving behind only the clay pot and Rachel's resilient defiance. That evening, when Elan returned, the cabin smelled of broth and barley. She served him a full bowl without a word. He sat by the lamplight, his gaze steady and guarded as he accepted the offering. "They came?" he asked, his voice low. "They left," she replied softly. His gaze drifted to the cradle where Nathaniel now slept. "And the woman?" Rachel smiled, a tired but resolute smile. A pot of stew and a few kind words. Elan nodded once, a deep understanding in his eyes. "Kindness is stronger than fear," he said, "but it must be chosen." They came just after dusk, when the last threads of light stretched thin across the plains and the wind began to change. Rachel knew before she heard their steps. She knew by the way the crickets fell silent. She knew by the way Nathaniel stirred in his cradle and whimpered, not from hunger, but as if he too could feel the invisible tremor passing through the earth. Elan, sitting by the fire sharpening a blade, paused. He lifted his head, listening. Boots, horses, voices. Then came the pounding on the door, violent and demanding. "Rachel Garrett, open up, you've got one chance." Rachel rose slowly from her chair, her heart a trapped bird against her ribs. Elan was already at the door, tall and silent. "No," Rachel whispered, not in fear, but with certainty. She placed a hand on his back. "Let me." She unbolted the door and pulled it open. Amos Dillard stood there, flanked by 6 men, including Ethan Cole, whose face was perpetually twisted in fury. "We warned you," Amos said, his eyes darting between Rachel and the tall shadow of Elan behind her. "Now you've left us no choice. Hand over the Apache and the boy." Elan stepped into the doorway, shielding Rachel. He wore no weapon on his belt, no blade in his hand, but he did not need one. His presence alone was steel. His calm silence in that moment was more unnerving than 100 threats. Ethan Cole's lip curled into a sneer. "Say something, savage. Or are you too much of a coward to face what's coming?" Still, Elan did not speak. He took one more step forward until he stood completely between Rachel and the men. Ethan lost his patience. He lunged, perhaps to grab the child, perhaps to shove past Elan, but before his hand could reach the doorway, Elan caught his wrist. With just one hand, unflinching, he twisted it downward with a force that was absolute but controlled, enough to drop Ethan to his knees. The rifle clattered to the ground. The other men tensed, their hands on their guns, but did not move under Elan's gaze. "You do not own this child," Elan said, his voice low but carrying. "You never will." He glanced at Rachel, then looked back at the men. "She is his mother, and I am his father." Rachel's breath caught. The fire crackled behind them. No one moved. Ethan pulled his arm back, seething, but did not dare to stand. Amos retreated a step, his mouth opening and closing. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You are not the law here, Mr. Dillard." Rachel stood taller, her voice steady. "And neither is your fear." Amos stared at her, then at Elan, and finally turned away. "Let's go." One by one, they retreated, leaving a space of silence and the smell of unfired gunpowder. When they were gone, Rachel slowly closed the door and leaned against it, her legs trembling. Elan picked up the fallen rifle and gently set it against the wall. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. Rachel looked at him, this man who had not drawn a blade, had not shouted, had only stood his ground with a stillness forged in years of fire. "What you said," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Was it true?" Elan looked toward the cradle, where Nathaniel was sleeping peacefully again. "Which part? That I am his mother?" Elan's eyes softened. "You fed him, you held him, you stayed," he said. "No blood makes you more his mother than that." "And you?" she asked. "I was ready to die for him," he answered simply. "So yes, I am his father." They stood there, the three of them, a woman who once grieved alone, a man who thought his people's story had ended, and a child born into fire but cradled in the arms of those who chose love over legacy. Outside, the wind shifted again. But inside, the Apache warrior placed his hand on Rachel's shoulder, a gesture both firm and gentle, as if to say, "We do not run from fire. We stand in it together." A fragile peace settled inside the log cabin. The threat from the town had receded for now, but the air remained heavy with vigilance. Elan went hunting and returned at twilight, a deer slung over his shoulder. But he was limping, one thigh wrapped in a blood-soaked rag. The deer, in its final throes of panic, had delivered a vicious kick. He had brought it back regardless. That night, Rachel knelt on the floor, gently cleaning his wound with warm water. His face glistened with sweat in the firelight. A fever was beginning to rise. She worked slowly, gently, her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. "You should have waited," she said. "You should have let me go." "I have hunted since I could walk," he replied, his voice hoarse. "The deer would not have waited for you." A soft, faint laugh escaped her. "Stubborn man." He said nothing, but the corner of his mouth twitched. As she wrapped the wound with a clean bandage, her fingers lingered on his skin, feeling the heat of the fever. "Elan," she said softly, her eyes not leaving the wound. He looked down at her, his own eyes darker in the firelight. "I am not afraid to love you anymore." Something shifted in him. His calloused, strong hand rose and covered hers where it rested on his leg. "You gave my son a name," he said, his voice rough with an emotion deeper than physical pain. "You gave us both a place." Rachel swallowed the ache rising in her throat. "Elan," she began, but he was already reaching for a cord around his neck, untying it. He took it off and placed it in her palm. It was a necklace made of dried corn kernels, polished to a soft golden sheen, strung between bits of turquoise and carved wood. At its center was a single white seed, round and perfect. "For you," he said, "so the land will remember that you are a part of it." Rachel stared at the necklace. "It's beautiful." "What does it mean?" "In my tribe," Elan said, "corn is life. It grows from the earth, feeds the people, connects the past to the now." He touched the white seed. "This one is rare. It means blessing, continuation." She closed her fingers around it, pressing it to her chest. "And you would give this to me?" He nodded. "You are not just feeding my child. You are planting something that will live longer than either of us." Her eyes filled with tears as she placed the necklace over her head. it rested against her collarbone, warm from his touch, light but powerful. "Next spring, we'll plant a garden," she murmured, resting her head lightly against his knee. "Corn, beans, and squash. The three sisters like your people grow." He looked down at her, his expression softening as never before. "And Nathaniel will grow strong with them." "I carved his name into the bean tonight," she said. "So, this house will remember." Elan closed his eyes. "It already does." They sat in silence, the fire crackling, moonlight slipping through the window. Elan's breathing slowed as the fever receded. Rachel closed her eyes, her fingers curled around the necklace at her throat. And deep in her soul, something had taken root, not just love, but belonging. Tomorrow, the world might knock on their door again with its judgment and its fear. But tonight, there was only warmth, the name of a child carved in wood, and the knowledge that a family had been born, not from blood, but from courage. Miriam's warning came as the sun had nearly set, its weak rays no longer strong enough to warm the air. "They are coming," she said, her voice urgent. "Tonight, Amos will not wait." Rachel's heart pounded against her ribs. There was no time to think. She hurriedly stuffed Nathaniel's blankets, a small loaf of bread, and some jerky into a knapsack, while Elan wrapped a sturdy leather sling around the cradle. Together they slipped out the back door, Rachel clutching Nathaniel. Close, Elan moving low with his rifle in hand. They moved in silence toward the timberline, their feet treading on brittle grass. The forest loomed before them like a cathedral of shadow and hush. Elan led the way, moving through the darkness as if a part of it, leading them deeper among the ancient trees where their passage was swallowed by the night. They reached the creek, its surface half frozen, a ribbon of silver woven through the rocks. Elan gestured for Rachel to follow a steep path upward, out of the valley. Nathaniel had drifted off to sleep in the warmth of his mother's arms. They climbed, but just as they crossed the creek, moonlight glinted off a rifle barrel. Then another. Dozens of shapes were waiting on the bank. A trap. Elan immediately pushed Rachel behind a moss-covered stump, his own rifle raised, his eyes like steel. "Stay here," he whispered. "Protect him." Amos Dillard stepped out of the shadows, a sneer on his face in the lantern light. "Come on out, Apache, and the white woman and your brat. We'll send you on your way." Elan's knuckles turned white around the rifle stock. Rachel hugged Nathaniel, squeezed her eyes shut, and thought of the necklace, of her son's name carved into the beam, of the life they were trying to build. A cold wind slithered through the trees. Then a shot rang out, but not from Amos's side. It came from behind them. A torch flared to life, and a tall figure emerged on the bank. Reverend Jonas Clay. Following him was a man wearing the star of the federal government. "Federal Marshal," the man said, his voice brisk. Rachel blinked through her tears. Elan slowly lowered his rifle an inch, weary but hopeful. Reverend Clay stepped forward, his voice ringing out. "Back off, Amos. This family is protected." Amos squinted, his face twisting with shock and fury. "This is Ranger territory. They lost that war," the marshal cut him off. "This child, his mother, and his father are under federal protection. One step further, and you take on the United States of America." A murmur ran through Amos's men. He spat on the ground. "We'll remember this." The marshal raised a hand. "Leave now, and consider this your only warning." Amos glared at Rachel, then at Elan, then back at the marshal. With a final sneer, he motioned to his men. They retreated, their boots slapping against the dirt, their lanterns bobbing and vanishing into the darkness. The moonlight returned, full and peaceful. The whole forest seemed to sigh in relief. Reverend Clay approached, his coat dusted with a thin layer of frost. "Are they hurt?" he asked, his tone urgent. Elan knelt by the creek. In the full glow of the moon, Rachel could clearly see the torn cloth on his thigh, where the old wound had bled anew during their flight. it was not over, but for tonight, they were safe. Tonight, law and compassion had won the day. A year had passed since that night by the creek. The night law and compassion had mingled under the moonlight. The seasons had turned over the red hills of Lone Mesa, and Rachel's cabin had grown, not just in its walls and structure, but in its spirit. A small garden now bloomed behind the house, and the sound of children's laughter often echoed from the porch. Rachel had turned the old smokehouse into a one-room school. Each morning, half a dozen children, settler and Apache alike, sat on benches that she and Elan had built together. She taught them letters, numbers, and how to speak to one another with kindness. Meanwhile, Elan had found a new peace in creation. His hands that once knew only weapons, now moved over the grain of wood with the gentleness of a creator. He had felled the pine himself, planed it smooth, and built a sturdy, beautiful crib. On its side, he carved the symbols of his people: the wind, protection, and new beginnings. On a quiet Sunday morning, he placed it beside Rachel's bed, his dark eyes glinting with a quiet pride. That evening, as the first stars pierced the velvet sky, Elan led Rachel to the fire circle behind their home. Strings of paper lanterns swayed in the breeze, and the scent of wildflowers braided with sage filled the air. He knelt on one knee, his palm open. In it lay a silver ring, engraved with Apache words that shimmered in the firelight. "Will you live with me?" Elan said softly, his voice holding the reverence of an oath. "Not as mine, but as my equal?" Rachel's breath caught. She knelt beside him, wrapped her arms around his neck and pulled him close. "I am already home." Reverend Clay stepped forward, not as a minister, but as a witness. Miriam Quinn lit the first lantern. Their ceremony was simple. Rachel wore a dress sewn by the Apache women, with beadwork in blues and whites that echoed the sky. Around her waist was a sash woven with the symbols of Elan's tribe. They stood under an arch of wood and wild vines, their hands joined in the firelight. No vows were needed. Their presence together was the only vow that mattered. The children tossed flower petals, and the lanterns floated into the sky, glowing like stars drawn down to earth to bear witness. When the last lantern had risen, Elan led Rachel inside. He took his carving knife and went to the thick crossbeam above the hearth. There, he carefully carved two names side by side: Rachel Nantan, Nathaniel. Then, he stepped back, looked at her, and said, "This is our home now." Rachel touched the names, feeling the grooves beneath her fingertips. So simple, so permanent. A record not just of people, but of belonging. Outside, the lanterns had faded, but inside, under the endless Texas sky, two hearts once broken had chosen not just to survive, but to live together. A family born not of blood, but of choice, and it would never be forgotten. Not by the land, not by the stars, and certainly not by the hearts that had courageously chosen it.